so much. And thank you to Judy for inviting me to do this. I'm going to jump right in. I grew up in Los Angeles with a mother from Alabama. My sister and I used to tease her about her accent, but we loved it. And my father was from Canada. Neither of them accepted religion. They became very political, and that's how we were raised. So I didn't know very much about Judaism, very little. We celebrated the holidays at home. We didn't belong to a temple. Passover for me was a bowl of matzah soup and gefilte fish and a nice meal. I didn't even know there was a Haggadah. You know, I didn't know the story until I went to the Jewish Community Center with my grandmother for one of those. Then I found out. So this posed somewhat of a challenge for me when I was writing my novel, because I really had to consult in a lot of ways about Jewish life, particularly Orthodox Jewish life. I did consult with Rabbi Nahum Yusevich. He's the Chabad rabbi over on Sutton, and he and his lovely wife Chayena helped me with a lot of the information. Also, there's plenty on the internet, so I use the internet. And so let me just go to this first slide. So I have a master's degree in ESL English. My creative writing was poetry and short stories, nothing really that I published, so the novel was my first real serious undertaking. And I will tell you how I got to that point as we go through this. But I taught ESL students from all over the world for 20 plus years, and their immigration stories were fascinating to me, and I loved being with people from other countries. So that right there drew me to the question of, as I got older and older, what about my great-grandparents? I know they were immigrants. My mother gave me a few interesting little stories about great-grandmother Rosalia. That's her right there. This, and here's the actual photo. This photo has got to be from the 1860s, the 1800s, excuse me. Not the 1860s, this is an old photo, because my great-grandfather, died in 1902. And he doesn't look quite like he's on the way out yet. So it was in the 1800s somewhere, maybe 1880s, 90s. So here's the real photo. So she told me some interesting things about my great-grandmother. She told me that she lost her father when she was 5 years old. So my grandfather, never met him. He died at a very young age. And they were left practically penniless. That would be 1921. There were no social programs. There might have been a soup kitchen. They were in the little town of Gadsden, Alabama. I don't think there was much for them. She had a hard, poverty-stricken childhood at that point. And great-grandmother Rosalia came from Arkansas down to Alabama, to Gadsden, to help out. My grandmother had to go to work full-time to support the family and get food on the table, which she barely did. And my great-grandmother came down and watched the children, my mother and her brother, my Uncle Bertie. So this is what she said to me about great-grandma Rosalia that intrigued me so much throughout my life. She was only 4'8". She had 8 children. Actually, that's not true. When I researched the genealogy, she had 10, but 2 of them died. And they were never spoken of by my grandmother. Like, I don't think she even realized it. They must have died soon and early. She had a terrible temper and treated my mother badly. I brought that temper into the character in the book. And she favored my uncle over my mom, boy over the girl. And there was some deep resentment there. I can understand it. And here's one of the most puzzling, and she was Orthodox Jewish, took my mom and took all of them to temple for every single Jewish holiday. Who knew? She didn't take me to any. So I was shocked when she told me, and she didn't tell me this until I was an adult. I was like, what? But that was the case. And she swore like a sailor. She swore so badly that none of the children in the neighborhood were allowed to play with my mom. So this is an amalgam of a character that I'm thinking, what? It raised questions that I couldn't answer. How did she learn to swear? Why did she swear? Why did she leave Germany to come here? I'm starting to ask all of these different questions. Why did they settle in Hot Springs, Arkansas? So I'm thinking about these questions after my parents have passed away. I have no aunts or uncles left. They've all passed away. Of course, the grandparents are gone. Nobody to answer my questions. I have other questions. Did they marry in Prussia? Or did they marry in Hot Springs? Actually, I did find out in my research that they married in Hot Springs in 1867, so that's accurate in the novel. Carl came to America in 1859. He came in 1859, before the Civil War. Why? Why did he come then? And what did he do during the Civil War? And that was something I researched, and I couldn't find out until I went to Hot Springs. Did he enlist? Did he fight for the Union? Did he fight for the Confederacy? Did he not? Did he stay in Hot Springs? I didn't know. Also, how did Rosalia get here? Did she travel alone or in the company of someone else? It doesn't seem like there was anyone else that traveled with her, because you'll see the family tree in a minute. Really, it was just them in the family tree, and then all of these descendants that they produced. How did they support themselves? Why would she travel so far to get married? Why didn't she marry someone right there in her town? So all of these questions, I thought about them, and then I started thinking even more deeply. What did they see when they got here? I mean, they were brave. Traveling was not fun back then. It was really awful. It was very hard, and it was dangerous, particularly for a woman. And what did they see? What was their travel like? What did they see when they got here? What was the Reconstruction era like for them? So my great-grandmother got here in 1866. The war ended, as you all know, in 1865. And there she is in the South, where black slaves have just been freed, and the white people that owned them are pissed. They're really angry. And they don't hide it. So what did they see? And did some of that blow over onto the Jews that were there? There was a small community of Jews there. And so because of their immigration, they saved our line. Leewitz, Germany, where my great-grandmother was born, was ground zero for World War II. I don't think any Jew survived, frankly. And that's a whole other story I don't have time for. But they saved us, and so I wanted to write something about them to honor them. So I thought I would write a family history, a little history book for my relatives, and so I started to do genealogy research. And I looked up let's see if the next one is the U.S. Census. So I got 2 censuses, and those were the most valuable pieces of information. I went on JewishAncestry.com. I went on Ancestry.com. I went to the Library of Congress. I had friends who were genealogy buffs looking for me, and all they found were the census. They said, "Oh, we found something." It was what I already had. I just didn't have a lot of material there to write a family history. So it was a bit frustrating. I even wrote for death certificates. I looked for marriage certificates online, death certificates, deed of property. I know they owned property. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No records. Not a thing. And I will be able to tell you why in a little bit. But here is the U.S. Census, and Judy suggested I get a pointer. So I went into my husband's shop. I married a builder, and I got a pointer. So here they are. Here they are. And notice the change. So what I learned in my research is that their names were fluid. They changed a little bit. Not a lot. But they went back and forth. So here his name is Gerson, totally misspelled. It's Gersman. Chaz, for Charles. So he was Carl, but here he's Charles. And over here, Lodger, had married, and he's a retail grocer. So I brought that into the retail grocer. Yeah, I brought that. Back here, Lisa. Pardon me?
It's hard to hear back here.
Oh, okay. He was a retail grocer, and I brought that into the story. And that was very common. As I did research, I found that the Jews that came and settled in Hot Springs, and probably in many other towns throughout the United States in the 1800s, many of them went into retail of some sort, clothing, furniture, even jewelry. I even ran across a couple of Jewish men who owned a stagecoach company that went from Little Rock to Hot Springs. So it was very interesting what I was running into. So here's Rosalia, and now she's Rosalie. So she changed her name to Rosalie. And here are some of her children. Sam, Gabriel, Berta, who's actually Bertha, and everyone called her Betty, and I met her. Albert, Isaac, Henrietta, we called her Henny, I met her too. And here they are, and they're all at home. So that's the 1880 census. Then I found the 1990 census, which I have highlighted here. Now we've got the name Gersman, okay, they fixed it. And apparently, and there's Rosa, that's Rosalia, Rosalie. Notice the change in names. And here are four of their children living at their home with them. The others must have gotten married and left or gone to school. Isaac, Henrietta, Dora, and Tina. Tina was my grandmother, and she was the last of all of the births. She was the youngest daughter. And now, Charles, I don't know if you can see it from here, but if you can't, I'll just read it for you. So they're born in Germany, the others were born in Arkansas, where is it? Somewhere around here, is a butcher. And so is Isaac.
It's all the way there. Right there.
Over here. Butcher, and so is Isaac. So apparently Isaac was apprenticing with his dad as a butcher. I had thought about perhaps having him be a blacksmith, but then when I saw this, I decided, no, this was when I was writing, I re-looked at this and went, no, I will have that be accurate. It is a novel, so I get to have that creative license, but I decided to keep it with what he really did. Kosher, butcher. I'm not assuming a kosher butcher. And also on here, something very important was their address. 215 Whittington Avenue. It's over here on the side. 215 Whittington Avenue. I actually went there. So, that was my research. And it really didn't produce enough to make any kind of a decent book or family history. So, however, I heard about the Mormon temple in Oakland. Ever been there? Anyone ever been to the Mormon temple in Oakland? It's fabulous. Although they won't let you in if you're not Mormon, but they will let you into the Family Visitor Center. And and they want you to go in there. They want you to find your relatives so they can convert your dead relatives to Mormonism. It's a very odd thing, but it's true. I mean, I'm not making it up. You can ask any Mormon. They want to do that.
There's a family history library right here in Nevada City.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah, I've heard of it. I've heard of it, but at the time I wasn't here. Anyway, so it's free. You can go in for free. You cannot check out the materials. They are valuable. They were like originals. You can make copies for 10 cents a page. I brought in my laptop. I'm a really fast typist. I just typed everything that I needed. So in the Mormon Family Temple Visitor Center, I discovered a few important things. The most important thing was that the Garland County Courthouse, Garland County is the county of Hot Springs, burned down in 1913 with all the records. Well, that explains it. That's why I can't find anything on them. It was at that point when I read that. I mean, if you could have only been a fly on the wall to see my face drop. Oh, it burned down, no wonder. That I decided, I thought about it a little. You know what? This is going to have to be a novel or nothing. Because there's just nothing here for me other than the bare bones. So what we were looking at with these census, this is like the skeleton of the story, the timeline. And I thought I'm going to make up a story based on what I think might have happened and make it creative and interesting. So I got my creative hat, took off my genealogy hat and put on my creative writing hat. That's what happened. In the Mormon Temple Family Visitor Center, you can go on microfiche and look for amazing stuff like the lists of the Confederate and Union soldiers during the Civil War. They got them. So I went on microfiche and I looked for Arkansas, and I looked for the list. I'm looking for Carl or Charles Gersman or Gerson. Looking and looking. He was not listed in the Union. He was not listed in the Confederacy. So I decided that when I wrote this story, he would not be in the Union, or he would not have gone to fight in the war. What he did, I'm still a blur. I just don't really know what he did. So it was something I needed to keep searching for. I did find newsletters there, written by pioneer women in the 1860s when my great-grandparents were living there. Actual newsletters. It was just amazing. And they're describing what they did, you know, their sewing groups, and they described the environment. What I read was there was so many animals, wild animals, in the woods around Hot Springs that all you had to do was just go out a few steps out with your shotgun and have dinner. That's kind of what they were writing. So I brought that into the novel as part of the environment. Lots of animals there. And that was very helpful. Other little details. Let's see. I reached out to Janice Wasserman, my mother's cousin, and she sent me a family tree scrawled, so I printed it. It's not complete, but I just wanted to show you. I don't know if you can see all of the words, but born Germany, Rosalia Wolfson, Charles Gersman, born Poland. Can y'all hear me back there? Mm-hmm. Okay. So here are their offspring. Gabe, who married Jenny, Henrietta, who married Charles Galen. I started to notice a repetition of names. Do you have that in your family? Have you looked at your family tree and said, dang, you know, there's names that keep coming up over and over. Dora and Sam, Betty and Sam Newman, Albert and Ray, Sam and Gussie, and I used Sam and Gussie as the secondary characters in the novel. Although in different generation. And here's my grandmother, Teeny, that everyone called her Teeny. I called her Nana. But my mother said her name was Augustina. So notice how my mother's father was named Ben and she married a Ben. Notice how my Uncle Bernie married a Rosalie, and here's Rosalie. You know, and there's lots of Charles and Carls. Here's Carl. Rosamond, I knew them. You know, these were the next generation down on my mother's family. So that was, you know, so I used some of the names in the novel. Well, that's a little premature, but I'll leave it up there. So now I had to go into some historical research. If I wanted to write my novel, I couldn't just, you know, write it. I needed a plot that would be interesting as well. So one of the things that really got me going was this book. I brought my books. I'm doing a show and tell. Island of Hope, Island of Tears by Brownstone, Frank and Brownstone. Yes. This was sent to me by my dearest friend Donna, whom I've known since childhood, one of those friends you have that is like a sister. And she wrote, Lisa, I hope you will enjoy this book. My hope is that it will shed new light on your family's roots. Love, Donna. No, it didn't. However, it did something very major for me. First of all, it described the whole experience of being an immigrant, a Jewish immigrant, or an immigrant, and they weren't just Jewish, it was European immigrants and various immigrants going through Ellis Island. Now, my great-grandparents did not, because Ellis Island was set up in 1892. So they were too early for Ellis Island. But it did describe the problem of human sex trafficking on these ships that came through. Really, when I read that, I was just shocked. And I felt like I couldn't let it go. I had to let people know that this was going on during those immigration periods. And so I decided that in part of the plot would be that my great-grandmother there would be an attempt to kidnap her. Of course, it could not be successful because here I am. But that was something I put in with this book. Here's another book. So for part of my historical research, I went into books. I went into the internet too, but that's boring. I'm not going to show you internet. And here's a great book called We Lived There Too. I got this, I believe, at Pegasus used, and as I was reading it, it just fell apart. But I could still read it. In their own words and pictures, pioneered Jews and the westward movement of America, 1630 to 1930. I went, wow, gotta get this book. So I did, and I read it, and there wasn't a whole lot about hot springs in it, but it gave me an idea of the whole historical background, the experience. What it did give me that I just loved was the great quote, in my opinion, in the front of my book, the segment of the poem. I don't know if any of you read that, if you read my book. It's 4 lines from a very long poem by I.J. Schwartz. I always forget the middle. Yeah, I.J. Schwartz in 1925. Written in Yiddish, translated into English. And the lines, I'll read it to you because some of you may have missed it. So this is a 2 or 3 page poem. This I felt was the beating heart of the poem, and I wanted it grabbed for my book. The Jew came to the unknown from afar, with sore feet, with a grieving heart, pack on shoulders, stick in hand, into the new, the free, gigantic land. So that always kind of breaks me up a little. So that really captures what was going on then. I still, and there were some accounts also of the lives of people in here. Details on travel, there were details on their businesses. There was a story of Flora Langerman, who started a secular school in New Mexico, where she settled. Apparently there were none. She started one with Jews and non-Jews mixed together. And, but nothing about Hot Springs or Arkansas really in here, not much. Well, so I needed to continue to find out what was going on in Hot Springs during those times. So I came across this book, I don't remember where. Look at the size of this. This book is, no, I did not read the whole book. Okay. But it's by someone named Carolyn Gray LeMaster. Doesn't sound Jewish. Maybe she is. And she wrote this book called A Corner of the Tapestry, and underneath the subheading is A History of the Jewish Experience in Arkansas. Score! 1820s to 1990s. All right. So I'm looking up, and it has an index. So I'm looking up Hot Springs. I find Hot Springs. It had 3 pages. 3 pages. 3 pages on Hot Springs. That's it. But they were valuable, brief, but it's mainly what she was doing was she's writing about different towns and stories about different Jews that none of the Jews that I was interested in, except, let's see, was it here? No, it might have been in another. Oh no, this one over here. Yes. Okay, I'm going to read this to you because it is hilarious and it might tie in. It is unfortunate for posterity that early records of the Hot Springs congregation were destroyed in 3 fires. Hence, all the fires in my book and the title. 1896, 1905, and 1913, and 1 flood in 1924. What early record is available shows a very colorful beginning. In the fall of 1875, 10 Jewish families organized a society to hold worship services during the high holidays. Their plans almost went awry when 2 members of the newly formed group, quote, revolted in revolting language and were expelled. Could that have been my great-grandmother? Was she swearing like a sailor in the high holidays? I don't know. They omitted the names of the swearers. But the reminiscences in the 1950s were shared about this instance, about this incident by Dave Bergauer and the Madames Renee Welcher, Gertrude Newman, an ancestor of mine. Wow. Yeah, I don't have the family tree up, but she was the child of Bertha and Sam Newman. There she is in the book. Wow. So, let's see. Anyway, so I'm beginning to suspect that there's not going to be a whole lot that I'm going to run into about Hot Springs, Arkansas in the 1960s. I did find, plenty in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. As it gets later, there's more. I'm thinking because of the chaos of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, maybe there just wasn't a lot of record about the place. Or some of it burned down. There were fires there. But I continued on, and I ran into a museum booklet, and that's this one right up here, when I was in San Jose. It was at a point in my life where I'm just, it's on my radar, and I'm seeing stuff, and I'm grabbing it. Unfortunately, I missed the exhibit. It was an exhibit of quilts made by Jewish pioneer women in San Jose. Doggone it, I missed it like by a day. But they did have an extra booklet for me with stories, wonderful, just heartwarming, stories you could just cry over about these women and their experiences as Jewish pioneer women, 1850 to 1910. So somewhere in there. Most of them were really closer to 1910 and not the decade of my great-grandmother. But it did help me, get an idea of what they went through. Let's see, and I also watched a 1-hour YouTube video of a man building a log cabin because I knew that I was going to have Carl building a house. And so it had to have no electricity, no batteries, right? It had to be all hand tools. So I watched it several times so that it could help me to describe him building. Since I ran a building company with my husband, I enjoyed doing that part. There were some things I already knew, but I had to keep from modernizing it. Another thing that I learned about was right here at the Empire Mine Park, and I'm wearing it. If you read the book, here's my prairie ring. Oh, gorgeous, ain't it? Not really. But I love it. The blacksmith told me about them. He said they used them in the pioneer days when they couldn't get hold of a ring. They took a nail, brought it to the blacksmith, and he showed me how he heated it and curved it and then cooled it. Then he gave it to me. So I learned something here. Okay, another question that I had. How about anti-Semitism during those times? Well, I already knew a little. Clearly, we know it exists in the South. My mother's brother, my Uncle Bernie, he told me when, he was over at our house and we'd chat, and he told me once, actually told me a couple of times, that there in the South where he grew up, which was in Alabama, there were white restaurants and there were black restaurants. I think a lot of you are already aware of that. That's no secret. And the white restaurants had signs on them that said, "No Jews or dogs allowed." So, there was plenty of anti-Semitism. The more I read, though, the more I found that in Hot Springs it wasn't so bad. They were welcomed. And they're always going to be individuals, right? They were welcomed, why? Because the Jews came from Europe. What did they do in Europe? Because of the Pale of Settlement rules, they couldn't live in cities. They couldn't have a brick and mortar business. They couldn't get educated. There were a lot of restrictions on them. And when they came to America, and so they peddled from town to town. They would peddle. That's why they were itinerant, because they couldn't have their own business. When they came to America, they could, and they did. And they were very industrious in Hot Springs. Hot Springs was a terrific place to have a business because not only was it a stopover for people still going west to seek gold in California, so they stopped to buy provisions, but also there were tourists and sick people coming from all over the world, from all over America and the world, to soak in the springs. Doctors were actually writing prescriptions for the hot springs. 3-month soak for arthritis, 6-month stroke for syphilis, 2-month stroke for cold. They were prescribing it for all kinds of, so you had lots of people coming through there with money. They could afford to go there. And so there were plenty of Jewish people who opened stores, and they brought revenue and they brought commerce into the city of Hot Springs, little city of Hot Springs, and they were welcomed overall. How about the Jews' reactions to these black Americans? How did they feel about the newly freed slaves? It's hard to tell. I'm going to be honest with you. My mother was kind of racist. She grew up in Alabama. My father put his foot down and said, I won't tolerate that. He grew up in Canada. My grandmother, who lived upstairs from us, was very racist. Where she got that, I don't know. Did she get that from great-grandma and great-grandpa? I do not know that. Could have asked her then, but I didn't. I modeled Carl after my father. And I allowed that to be a possibility. And why not? Why not be interested and curious and compassionate? Why be hateful? Does everybody have to be hateful? All right. So because of my interest in cultural differences, I wanted a plot involving the American Indian tribes of Arkansas. I started out having Indians be a big part of it, and then I learned, oops, they were all gone by 1859. They had been marched, unfortunately, the Trail of Tears in 1832 to the Oklahoma Reservation, and they were gone. But I still wanted to create an Indian character, so I had him be half white, half Indian, so that he could live in the town and interact. And I looked up his name, Wadite, if you remember. Wadite is a Quapaw language. The Quapaw tribe lived there. They never lived. No tribes lived in hot springs. They hunted through, is what they did. And they would stop and soak in the hot springs, and then they'd keep hunting. So it was mainly the Quapaw and the Cherokee. The Quapaw word, Wadite, means crosses the stream. I liked it. So I chose it. I came across a book about the American Indians. This is interesting, Jews among the Indians. Jews among the Indians. Have you ever imagined a book called Jews among the Indians? So, as soon as I saw it, I just grabbed it. So, okay, whatever, I'm reading it. And let's see if there was something here. I have a couple of places, but no, not really. I don't want to get into this too much because Wadite was really the only one there, and I wanted to represent the Indian existence in Arkansas from the past. But there's a picture here. You can come up afterward and take a look. I know you can't see it from here. But here's a Jewish guy sitting with this tribe of Indians. He's honoraries. His name is Julius Meyer. And they gave him an honorary Indian name that I can't pronounce. It's very long. And it translates into curly-haired white man who speaks with one tongue. And part of that is because part of it is because he bothered to learn their language, which a number of Jews did. They bothered to learn the American Indians' languages and traded with them. Became, they built their wealth on, started out like that. And why did they learn the language and not the white Christian people? Didn't bother really very much. I don't have any record of that. I thought about that for a while, and I thought, well, look, they come here, the Jews came here, they already knew German. They already knew Yiddish, for sure. My grandmother spoke Yiddish. They already probably knew some Hebrew, and maybe they even knew a little, French. So why not another language? But also because the Jews tended to trade very fairly with the Indians, and they appreciated that. They could see that. Here's another of these books. When I went to Hot Springs, I bought this book. Didn't All the Indians Come Here? This was written by Park Ranger, Hot Springs National Park Ranger, Mark Blauer, whom I met and autographed it for me. And it was just dispelling the fact from the fiction about the Indians. The hot springs were not sacred, they were not magical, they didn't have powwows, they just soaked in them just like everyone else. Enjoyed them. So that, was interesting. But again, this is material that maybe I couldn't use. I did come across this in a bookstore, Secrets of the Civil War. I'm going, okay, get it? Because I didn't want to write about the Civil War. It's already been done. It's called Gone with the Wind. I didn't have that one. But I thought I would just learn a little historical background, so that I can be knowledgeable when I write my book. And come to find out, here is an article called Jewish Johnny Rebs. I didn't even know it was in here. I just picked up the magazine and grabbed it. And it says that, it's actually, I'd love to read the whole thing to you, but we don't have time. But bottom line is, Jewish soldiers fought for the South. A lot of them fought for so the ones that lived in the South fought for the South for many reasons, but the chief reason was to do their duty. They were considered, okay, I'm going to read this part. It was a cardinal belief of anti-Semites and others in the 19th century that the wandering Jew was a citizen of no country, that Jews were cowards, and that they were disloyal. This had been a staple of Judeophobia in Europe since the Middle Ages. Thus, like African American soldiers who wanted to prove that they were equal and they were men, so the Jews wanted to stand up for whatever state they were in this case, Arkansas. But they did not, it was not necessarily an advocacy of slavery. So that was interesting. I wanted to incorporate I wanted to incorporate the hot springs themselves as a symbol, as a landmark, a natural phenomenon, and integrate them into the plot. So the hot springs helped the hot springs helped hot springs prosper in the Reconstruction era when many other southern towns were hurting. And this could very well be why there was a vibrant Jewish community there. Jews heard about it, or you heard from another relative and went there to open businesses. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the hot springs briefly. The hot springs, because it's just amazing, and I couldn't put it all into the book because we know about this in more modern times. They didn't know in 1860. I asked Mark Blauer, the park ranger, I said, did they know that? And he goes, nah. The hot springs are created by this. The rain comes falling down. It sinks into these fissures in the novaculite that they have there. It's a particular kind of like a loose limestone. And they sink down in, and it takes this rain that falls 5,000 years to travel down, and they get heated by the pressure of the earth. They're not heated by molten magma or lava or anything like that. They're heated by the pressure of the earth, because pressure creates heat. And then they get squeezed back up, and they come out at Hot Springs Town at 140 degrees or so. So you can't really jump right into them.
Did you know how deep it was? How the depth of it?
How far down it went?
Yeah.
I don't think anyone knows. But that's a good question. I wish I knew. A couple miles? I don't know. So the city did, they built conduits and pipes to cool the water and guide it into bathhouses. There's a whole bathhouse row in Hot Springs, and I did go there, and I soaked in I took a bath, a Hot Springs bath. So the bathhouses are now defunct, except for 2. But back then, they had some nice ones, and I put that into the novel. I described that. I wanted to make it very clear. I saw photos. There are some photos of the area in Hot Springs itself. You have some old photos back in the 1860s. There were little shanty town built up around the Hot Springs, and cornhole pools. I have a photo of that from the Garland County Historical Society in the book, in the front of the book. And so if you could afford a soak, you had a very nice bath. And they became nicer and nicer over time. They became a big business. And then one of the things that affected it was penicillin. No one was prescribing the hot springs anymore for a lot of stuff. They were prescribing medications. And people preferred to take a pill for a couple of weeks than go for 3 months. And so, so that kind of, most of the bathhouses there, except for 2, the Quapaw bathhouse, which is modern, and the Buckstaff, which is old. And I did the old one. I was dying to do the new one, but I thought, nope. I was here and I flew to Hot Springs for research. Darn it, I'm going to do the old one. And it was old. And in fact, the next slide may show, yeah, Buckstaff baths. So the front looks nice, a blue and white striped awnings. On the inside, it also has nice material because any of those fancier bathhouses are going to cater to the tastes of wealthy people. So they have marble slabs and stained glass quite pretty. This one had an elevator that was so old I almost panicked. So I had only 2 people could fit in. It had one of those that had those crossbars that close and noisy and creaky. I thought, oh God, I hope I survive. and then when I got into the bath to the with the hot springs water, the attendant, who was black, all of the attendants were black there. This is like a carryover kind of from the old times. Brought me a little cup of the hot springs water, and it was really the most delicious water I've ever had. I mean, it was almost sweet, but it was pure water. And at my feet was a little motor that ran and made bubbles. That's how old it was. It was an actual little motor, there. Very strange. So now the other bathhouses are gift shop. You have one is a brewery, one's a museum, one's a visitor center. There's only 2 left. Let me check the time. Okay. So I researched the Ku Klux Klan because I wanted to find out what was going on with them during that time period. Really not a whole lot. They were just beginning. Actually, they kind of established themselves in the 1870s. But there were little bands kind of getting started in Tennessee. So I decided to write one into Arkansas, into Hot Springs. They did not start out in sheets and hoods. They started out with crazy clothing and antlers, once again to scare and intimidate, but that's how they started out. So I put that in, just to give them the sense of what was happening, give the reader a sense of what was happening in the Reconstruction era. There were not many lynchings in Arkansas, but there were some. There were a lot more in Mississippi and Alabama. But I wrote one in, again, to just create that world of the violence of the Reconstruction era. And one of the things that I learned that was very valuable, and I put that in the novel as well, because I wanted to know what was going on with the black people during that time period, because my great-grandparents saw that, was a PBS special, The Aftermath of the Civil War, the Reconstruction era. So I saw that in the guide and went, oh, gotta watch it. And what I learned, one of the big takeaways I learned was that the first thing that the newly freed black slaves did once they got their freedom, they didn't run off. Most of them did not run off to the north or somewhere else. They stayed around looking for their families, which makes perfect sense because so many of their families were torn apart and sold. And they don't know where they were sold to. They didn't tell them where, well, I sold your wife to, down the road. So they had a lot of time looking. They spent a lot of time looking for their families, and I put that into the novel. So I mentioned this a couple of times, but I did go to Hot Springs for a week of research and exploration in 2010. I hiked the Hot Spring Mountain. I've got a picture of that here. And here is a view of Hot Springs from Hot Springs Mountain. You can just kind of drive downtown and park your car and walk right into the hot springs. They're very accessible, they're very available. Actually, the entire town of Hot Springs is designated a national park because of the hot springs. And so I hiked up the hill with my friend Roberta. I went with my friend Roberta Mazel. And here's a view, and this is the town of Hot Springs. This is the downtown area here. Notice how it's just kind of nestled into like a gorge, with the hills and mountains rising around them. So I wanted to get a lay of the land. I wanted to be able to do a little description in my writing as the plot rolls out. So I went there, walked around, walked downtown, went to 215 Whittington, where my great-grandparents had lived, and saw nothing much. I think it was nothing that I even took a picture of. It was like a warehouse near a creek, but obviously, it was not what they had built. So that's Hot Springs. It's a very small town. But it's actually a small city. It is a city. But I still needed to find out what people did during the Civil War. What did my great-grandfather do? My great-grandmother wasn't here yet. So one day, while I was in Hot Springs, I went with Roberta to the Arlington Hotel. A very old, it burned down in 1913, and built up again. There's just a lot of fires in Hot Springs. And I found out when I went into the lobby of the Arlington Hotel, they had a PS, a great big Model T, which was owned by Al Capone. The Chicago mobs came to Hot Springs for rest and relaxation. And they're residents of Hot Springs are very proud of that fact. They got that all over. They got photos of them and artifacts and memorabilia and all. So and they loved the Arlington Hotel. So in the lobby was, on the side of the lobby was a little Civil War memorabilia room with guns, pistols, and uniforms, and flags, and boots, and etc. Lots of things in glass cases. And there was a curator. So I went up to him, and I said to him, we chatted, and I said, what did everyone do in Hot Springs? I can't find out from any of my research, what they did during the Civil War. And he said, most of them fled. Hot Springs was looted and pillaged by bushwhackers and jayhawkers. Bushwhackers, I believe, support the Confederacy, and the jayhawkers support the Union. But it doesn't matter. They're just roving bands of bandits that took advantage of the chaos of the war. And they came in and they just ruined the towns. They set Hot Springs on fire and burned it almost completely down. And so that's in the book now. And now I know. But where did Carl go? I will never know where he went. I mean, there's no journals, there's no letters, nothing. So I decided that he would flee to New Orleans. They either went, the Civil War expert told me, they either went to Little Rock, the state capital, because the Union forces had that town, in their grip. So you could go there and it wasn't going to be pillaged. Or you could go to New Orleans. Or you could flee to the mountains to your relatives and hide up in the mountains with relatives and friends. I don't think he would do that because I don't think he had relatives and friends in the mountains. So I had him going to New Orleans, and I worked that out to be part of the plot where Rosalia comes in on the boat. And then they have Rosa and Simon Meyer there who escort Rosalia to Hot Springs. So that's all fiction. I don't know if it happened that way. I don't think it did. She may have come in through New York, but I wanted it to come this way. And when I was researching New Orleans, which I've been there 4 times, so I kind of can get the lay of the land and write it. When I researched New Orleans in 1866, which is when she came in, I stumbled across the Black Massacre of New Orleans. Horrible. Voter suppression, just like what's going on today, violent. So it was a group of, an integrated group of I believe they were city councilmen meeting in the chambers. And this massacre rolled out when a bunch of angry white guys with their guns came and decided to kill all black people who were dared to be in government. And so it was supported by, unfortunately, the mayor and the police department supported this massacre. So there was no recourse for any of them. And so I decided that when Rosalia came in, it was in July, that she would land in July, and she would run into this, because I wanted to make this event known to the readers, as part of our history. I also needed to learn about the Victorian era, because it was not just the Reconstruction era, it was also the Victorian era. So if I'm going to describe their clothing, I had to know about it. How was I going to do that? I didn't really know a lot about the clothing back then. You see it around in the Victorian fair. But what I ended up doing, this was one of the most interesting things I did in my research besides flying to Hot Springs, which was fantastic, was I became a docent at the Ardenwood Farm in Fremont, California. Whoops. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Okay, let me finish Hot Springs first. Okay. I went to the Jewish cemetery. So when I was in Hot Springs, I met with the rabbi, and I saw the names of my ancestors up on the wall on plaques, and he sent me to the Jewish cemetery. Lo and behold, there's a Jewish cemetery in Hot Springs. Who knew? So Roberta and I drove over there, and here's proof. Here it is. It's a Jewish cemetery. It's very old. It goes back to the 1800s. And here's my great-grandfather's gravestone.
Wow.
I took a picture of it. You may not be able to see the engraving, it's kind of faded, but it says Carl Gersman. So now we're back to Carl. And that's the stone I put a stone on there.
We have 2 Jewish historical cemeteries here from the Gold Rush time.
Yes, I know, and you know who showed them to me? Judy. Judy Silverman showed them to me. It was awesome. And here is Rosalia's gravestone. And now she's Rosalie. She's stuck with Rosalie. And interesting, because her gravestone says, Rosalie, wife of Carl Gersman. Her full name is not there. You know, it's not Rosalie Wolfson Gersman or Rosalie Gersman. It's just Rosalie, wife of Carl Gersman, July 17th, 1845. Okay, and so I've heard that her year of birth was 1844. So that's fluid too. All these years are juggling around, 1 year or 2 years off. So I just thought, I'm not going to worry about it. And that's how important it was to be a married woman. You know, that was your claim to fame as a woman. You were married to someone, a man. So I became an Ardenwood Farm volunteer. Here's the manual up there. Here's the manual. And it was a wealth of information, and it was really a good time. I had to study, and being a teacher, I was able to study about the history of Clara and George Patterson in Fremont, who made quite a nice living shipping their farm produce on boats across the bay to San Francisco. And I had to learn all about them and their children and the stories and blah, blah, and the furniture and the materials that the house was made out of, and the secret compartments that they always had in the Victorian secretaries and the children's toys. One thing I did there that I just loved was that you could take a class. They had outdoor arts and crafts classes. So I took one to make a corn husk doll. And that's what I did. I made this corn husk doll. And that's what they did back then in the 1800s. Now this farm, the Ardenwood farm, is geared to the 1890s. So I kind of had to extrapolate a little back to the 1860s, but I'm figuring, hey, they probably did this in the 1860s. Pretty basic. You know, if you weren't rich and couldn't go out and buy a porcelain doll at a store, people made these. It was a lot of fun to make, and I put that into the story. And kind of a symbol of Rosalia, no face, kind of lost. You know, who am I? I immigrated. I had to flee my country. Who am I? All right, and so the last thing I'm going to talk about, I think, because I don't want to run into too much time here, is I needed to learn about ocean travel, right? Because she traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. So did Carl, but I didn't deal with that. I dealt with her mostly for the travel part. And I decided that she traveled alone, that they were too poor in Gliwice, Germany. Gliwice, by the way, I'm thinking of it as like a shtetl, you know, like a little Jewish town. No, it was an industrial city. There were plenty of Germans there in a Jewish quarter with lots of, they had breweries, they had quarries, they had paper mills, bookstores. So I was surprised. That's where my great-grandmother came from. But she had to travel, so I did a lot of research on that via the internet. I stared at a lot of Google images of steamships for hours, different directions. But what was really the greatest thing was that I went down to Southern California to visit some cousins, and we went and visited the Queen Mary that's docked in Long Beach. Now the Queen Mary is a state-of-the-art 7 or 8 story, 9-story steamship. And so I had to kind of extrapolate also back to 1860s. They certainly were not building those. In the 1860s, the steamships had been recommissioned from the Civil War to be passenger ships. And one of the ones that was decommissioned from the war and changed into a traveling ship was the USS Eolus. And so I used that one. And I learned that there were first class, second class, third class, fourth class in the Queen Mary. In the 1860s, I decided there would be a first and a second class, that's it. I don't think there was anything fancier than that. But what I learned, and then there was steerage, and a lot of the immigrants went in steerage. Steerage is basically your boiler room. It's a horrible place to travel. It's uncomfortable, it's just disgusting. And I didn't want to put Rosalia in that. so I had them save money for her so she would be in second class. But what I learned was, first class passengers on these steamships back then could go anywhere they wanted. But all of the other classes had to stay in their level. And there were dining rooms for each level. So if you were third class, traveling third class, you went to your third class dining room. This is what the ship's historian told me. I talked to him about that. I asked him, would a woman be traveling alone, do you think, during those times? And he said, no, absolutely not. They didn't. But I think that in the 1860s, they had to sometimes, because he was oriented toward the early 1900s. So that was really interesting. And as I said, I decided she would land in New Orleans, and I had to research New Orleans. The port was a deep water. Anyway, so I think that's the last of my, no, here's one more. This was one of the things that was in the lovely things in the manual, this is the clothing. This is an example of the hats. You got boots in here, you got trousers, you got skirts, all kinds of wonderful stuff in here. And so that was very helpful to me in writing the book. So I'm going to wrap it up now and in conclusion say that this started out to be a quest for family history and ended up being a creative writing novel. And I just loved writing it. My creative juices had to roll, and I had to fill in the questions, and I had to answer my questions the best I could. And some of it is fiction, and some of it is fact. And that's it. Thank you.